Good afternoon, and we have the great honor and privilege of being the panel that follows lunch. And so our job is to really make it worth your while to not go home and take a nap. And I assure you that after the next hour with these three remarkable women, you'll be happy you came here. So we have three women, three of my sheroes, I should say, with us. And the question, feminism, the challenges for feminism in the 21st century. Our panelists are Faye Wattleton, Laurie Simmons, and Eleanor Heartney. And you have their bios, the distinguished descriptions of these three women. So I won't talk about that, other than to say it's wonderful to have props like this. Faye, your best-selling autobiography, and Eleanor, some of the art criticism that you've written in projects that you've curated here. Let me just ask you, feminism today, in some ways, is really challenged because people think of feminism as this movement, and often movements are defined and the narrative around movements are pretty homogeneous. But in fact, feminism is challenged today just as it was in the 1960s. Is that a fair thing to say? Please.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, first of all, there's several, and we'll probably get into this, you know, there are a variety of different kind of definitions and ways of thinking about feminism. It sort of almost makes sense more to talk about feminisms than feminism. But in terms of challenges, I think it's a particularly peculiar moment. On the one hand, you know, it's very likely to be electing our first woman president. So that seems to be a great triumph for feminism. On the other hand, I have to say that this election campaign has been full of more misogyny than any I can remember. And in many ways, I think that the constituency that is following her opponent are motivated in many ways by anti-feminism and anti-multiculturalism, by the sense that, in a way, you know, they have been left out, they have been left behind, that, you know, that these other groups have been privileged over them and they are full of resentment. So if we look internationally, we can see also, I mean, challenges to feminism. We see, of course, you know, more and more world leaders who are women. You know, we see in every field there are increasing numbers of women, although if we do the statistics, we see that it still, you know, falls far short of men. On the other hand, you know, we also see that, you know, internationally there's a big threat to women. Certainly, you know, the way in which women are kind of used as pawns in a lot of the military conflicts that are going on right now, you know, rape as a weapon of war. And, you know, in many of the kind of radical Islamic governments, you know, a lot of them seem to be about disempowering women. So it's in a very peculiar place right now. And so the challenge really is, are the ways that we've been thinking about it in the past really, you know, up to the challenges that we face now?
So Faye Wattleton, head of Planned Parenthood, the iconic civil rights leader, you were there. You were a child, of course, in those early days of the movement, but are things better today?
Well, I think there's no question that things are better for women today than they were in those years in terms of the enunciation of rights. And at least an articulation of a goal and aspirations that open the possibilities for women. In many ways, we are struggling with the success of those years and the progress that was made, that was informed by the peace movements and the civil rights movements. Coming out of the 60s and 70s were times of tremendous turmoil in the country. And as often happens when there is social turmoil, movements evolve and emerge. that give rise and gives increased status and elevated status to a disenfranchised. We're living now in a time in which we must grapple with the fruits of those labors. And that's really the challenge before us in the 21st century. Many say that our daughters don't appreciate what they have. Well, no, they shouldn't appreciate what they have because they didn't go through what it took to get what they have. But then we have to articulate what are the measures that need to keep moving forward as opposed to backward, as we have seen in the area in which I have spent most of my career, which is reproductive rights, where there has been a very definitive erosion in the rights that were hard fought, and won largely out of a judicial revolution.
And Laurie, artist, photographer, filmmaker, you're clearly on the front lines as an artist. How do you see this question?
Well, interestingly, though I see my entire lens, my entire focus is through the world and ideas of visual arts, I really believe in the power of language. And I really believe, to put it in 21st century terms, that feminism needs a big, fat rebranding. Because I see so many examples of young women who, if I put the progressive agenda of feminism in front of them, they would agree with they would tick every single idea on the list. Women's reproductive rights, equal pay, everything that you could possibly think of. But when they think of the word feminist, perhaps they think of someone from my generation, a second wave feminist who burned her bra, hated men, these are cliches, didn't shave her legs, whatever their idea is that they can't relate to, it's a problem. And it's interesting because the other day I was listening to a town meeting with the Green Party candidate, Dr. Jill Stein, who took issue with Hillary Clinton's feminism because she thought a feminist cannot be a hawk, cannot believe in war, because a feminist must believe in our children and the safety of our children. And I thought about my own point of view, and I could imagine having tremendous respect for a woman general and feeling that she was a feminist and thinking that the whole idea of feminism is not specific, it's being redefined all the time. And on the other hand, there are a number of young women I know who would say that Kim Kardashian is an absolute feminist because she controls her own brand, she's made lots of money, she uses her body the way she wants. She expresses herself that way. And a second wave feminist from my generation would say, no, she's objectified by men. She holds herself up to the male gaze. She's male identified. So what I'm trying to present is the confusing part of the definitions.
In many ways, you're talking about empowerment. And how, in fact, as Faye said, the fruits of all of the work that you all have put in. So now we have this generation of empowered young women and men, and the contradictions of that empowerment. I was just in Durban at a conference, and there was a very clear debate among the people there around sex work. And the strong point of view by some women that sex work is prostitution and should be criminalized. And another group of women who said sex work is a form of labor and should be regularized and should be treated like all other forms of labor. And just watching how these groups of women had very clear contradictory points of view about what represents empowerment of women in the 21st century.
Well, I mean, I think Eleanor said it earlier that, no group of women, let alone a revolution of women, are going to have the same point of view, nor should they. I think this whole notion that women should line up behind a label, and I mean, it was a value to have the Equal Rights Amendment as a vehicle to focus and rally around, which we were not successful in achieving. But at the same time, this is a much more complex world. And so to expect that women are going to see it all the same in the same way is really unrealistic, frankly. And I think we need to abandon that kind of strategy. I'm all for abandoning the word feminist because I don't know what it means. I don't know why it's necessary. Why is it necessary for me to say I should be paid the same for work, similar work as a man? I should have representation that reflects my presence in society. I don't need a label for that. I need the justice of that. And that's really where I think we get hung up on the labels. It would be nice kind of if we had an ERA campaign going again, because that would rally us around perhaps violence against women, which is the #1 threat. But I think that we spend a little bit too much time thinking about labels and not really thinking about what's really going on and where do our daughters have to go to continue to progress.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said, in a way we have to talk about maybe feminisms, or we have to talk about, there are these kind of very different and sometimes, as you're pointing out, kind of contradictory ways of thinking about what feminism is. On the one hand, the notion of feminism as, kind of working through the legal system, egalitarianism in, kind of all these, in terms of wages and opportunities, et cetera. In a strange way, that is a form of feminism that's very aligned in a way with, a kind of very individualistic, we could say capitalistic, we could say upper middle class sort of vision. There are versions of feminism, and this goes back, again, to the origin of, I think back in the 70s, when we all kind of started out, a notion of feminism that thinks about it as a different way of thinking about the world, so that it's about thinking about a more kind of interconnected, a more communal, a different sort of set of values. So from that perspective, this kind of just sort of pushing people, making sure that you have, kind of enough women in the same slots that already exist, is sort of contradictory to this notion of kind of remaking the world in a way that is better for everyone. And in some ways, if we look at this current, political campaign, you could make the argument that Bernie Sanders is more of a feminist in that sense than Hillary Clinton is. In the sense that, his vision, which is a kind of much more, it's about talking about everyone. And I think that the problem a lot of younger women have with feminism is that they do feel that it's very polarizing, this kind of definition that sort of, and it is the stereotype that Laurie's talking about, but that it's a very polarizing idea for them, and they don't want to be polarized in that kind of way. So it's complicated because I think that the different kind of ideals of feminism that have come down to us sometimes are in conflict. And, it's kind of one of the things I think we need to do, and also I think we need to let the younger people do, is to think about how to reconcile those.
Well, I think that there's a difference between polarization and being disruptive for change, and that nothing has ever changed without disruption. The notion that somehow we have to bring everybody together when we're trying to change a system perhaps is unrealistic. And yes, wages are an important factor. When a poor woman can't earn a decent living and she's working full-time and she's earning less than her male counterparts, those are not issues of upper-class white women. Those are the issues of the people who are really at the bottom, most vulnerable part of the rung. And so I think we have to put this, remember that we really are talking about human beings within society, to live within society, but change does not come without disruption. It just doesn't happen.
And Laurie, you've got two prominent activist daughters.
Well, that's what I wanted to speak to, speaking of disruption. And I do agree with you that we need to retire the word, put it somewhere in a box with suffragette. Just get rid of the word and find another way to deal with the issues that we're all discussing. But what I did want to say about having two daughters who are activists is that one of the messages to young women today, and to young men to some degree, is if you do speak out, there will be consequences. The iteration of feminism that we were all involved in involved meeting personally, marching, doing whatever we do. This was pre the digital age. For both my daughters, one of my older daughter, Lena Dunham, came out in support of Hillary Clinton, is a very vocal supporter of Planned Parenthood, is an admitted survivor of date rape who's spoken out about that. What happens on her Instagram site, what happens on her Twitter, the kind of hate mail that she receives is terrifying. And to take it one step farther, we have to be the only artist family in the United States that's ever been profiled on the Breitbart, on the Breitbart report. I mean, there have been 30 articles about my daughter in Breitbart. My work's been reproduced on Breitbart as the perverse mother of the activist. My husband's work has been beautiful reproductions, I might add. But our whole family has been the focus of so much negativity because of having activist daughters. So if a young woman is looking at Lena's Instagram feed, which has millions of followers, she will see that if Lena posts something about speaking at the DNC or comes out in support of Planned Parenthood, there will be hideous trolling and also death threats on Instagram, which we all think of as being lots of pretty pictures. So it's a very, there are so many mixed messages for young women who do want to participate about what will happen to them.
So one of the things that I just witnessed as we were backstage and you guys looked out and you said, look at all the men in the room. What about the men? What's the role of men?
I know I just spoke, but so many of the men I know I would call feminists, and I don't think that I could have raised two daughters as an artist without being married to a feminist. And I think there's too little attention paid to this, to the idea of the men that are part of the support system who do call themselves feminists.
Yeah, and I would say, too, that, you know, one of the problems with kind of the bad old stereotype of feminism, the word that maybe we're retiring here, you know, is that it tends to be seen as a kind of zero-sum game, you know, and I think that's what's being played out in this election as well. You know, that the notion that if women gain, men lose. That's really, I think, a lot of the resentment among the Trump supporters has to do with that. And that's why I think we have to think about it in a different way and to talk about the way in which if these things that help women help men as well. I mean, you think about sort of the whole issue of parental leave, for example, you know, things that are seen as that's a woman's issue. But no, in fact, you know, if we could make the labor force, you know, the conditions for labor more humane, you know, this is something that helps everyone. So I think that it's very important actually to be aware that if feminism isn't just about sort of, you know, advancing, you know, a certain number of women into the positions that, you know, of the structure that already exists, but instead, as I say, it's about kind of reshaping that so that, you know, it's a more humane system for everyone. Then it becomes clear that it's not a kind of us versus them situation.
And really it's about moving the systems and structures and cultural practices to work for men better too.
Well, I think that the trap that has often we've often fallen into is that somehow men hold the power, and so we're trying to get it away from them. So we need their cooperation to get that power away from them. And I know we agree that we were going to use the word patrimony.
Patriarchy.
Patriarchy. We could use the word patrimony, correct?
Yeah, right.
Patriarchy, but I think that is inherent in this formulation, this construction. Without recognizing, no, it's not a zero-sum game because the power is ours, and it should be ours to shape the society so that it is a just society for women as human beings. Half the population, as I said yesterday in the brief. And so it should be just a foregone conclusion that we will have reasonable representation in the political structure. We will not be subjected to violence. We will have equitable access to health care. That doesn't require a man giving something up for me to say to a researcher, would you please do this research project on women because I am not a feminized man? And so it really does cause a different framing of the conversation as much as the reality of carrying out, continuing to carry out these changes.
So you're suggesting that actually the construction of patriarchy as a problem is misplaced, and that women, in spite of the fact that you also say that men hold a disproportionate amount of economic power and other forms of assets that women do not have.
That women do have access to, but do not take and own and hold. And that's, for instance, I was on the board of a major beauty, I don't know why, I'm struggling with this to say. I was on the board of Estee Lauder for a number of years. I was the only woman on that board. And after so many years of being quiet and not disruptive, I said to the heads of Estee Lauder who wanted me to chair the nominating committee, I will not chair a nominating committee if more women are not brought on this board. I just won't do that. I wasn't taking anything away from men. I was recognizing that here is a company, for better or for worse, serves primarily women. And so to add, as it turns out, the board was enlarged, to add women to the board in a position of power, the boardroom of a now $10 billion company, was important to me to do that in the position that I held. It was not a zero-sum game for anybody. It was just say, I'm advancing women here. I'm in a position that I can advance women, and I'm going to take it.
And actually, this raises I think, kind of an important point. And Laurie and I, of course, come at this from the art world position. And there's been a lot of research about kind of women in various aspects of the arts, and in relationship to the number of women who have museum shows, or the number of women who have gallery representation,
who are
directors, etc. And one of the things that all the statistics seem to indicate is that women, it's gotten better over the years, but there's a kind of leveling out at about 25 to 30%, which interestingly is about the same for many other fields as well. If you look at Congress, for example, I mean, that's kind of the same. Somehow that seems to be what we get. We get about a third, But the thing that in the art world, part of what sort of sustains that, it's not just men, who are kind of keeping women out. There's a lot of women dealers. There's a lot of women collectors. There's a lot of women, who are on boards of museums, and they also seem to be, I think it's a structural problem. It's not simply just, kind of, again, this sort of polarizing men versus women, but women are also, in a way, part of this problem of keeping this status quo the way it is.
Which is not unusual to have groups who have historically been oppressed, in fact, become people who reinforce the oppressions of their own. Sometimes implicitly, I experienced that with the panel process at the foundation with artists and wanting to have more women artists. Mm-hmm. And we thought by starting out 50-50 in terms of the nominators, that we would get roughly, what happened was most of the women nominated men. Mm-hmm. And so what we got, we consistently had more men than women fellows. And so ultimately we had to say, we have to put more women nominators than just a majority. We have to have 60, 70% of women nominators to get a gender balance and parity, because as you say, the women were nominating more men. Mm. Laurie.
Well, I think that, to globalize the art world conversation a little bit more to something we can all relate to, I think the issue often becomes one of who are the gatekeepers. Who are the gatekeepers at museums? Who are the people at the top of the structures? Who are they hiring? And it's very possible to know the mind and the political mind and heart of the person you're hiring. It's possible to interview someone and say, how do you feel about the ratio of women artists to male artists? How do you feel about women artists? This is true across the board. it comes from the top down, and it's the people you have at the gate letting people in who are going to be conscious of the quotas, whether we're talking about men and women, transgender people, gay people, straight people, racial issues. It's who we're hiring, who we're trusting, and who we're putting in the position of opening the gate. And I think that's something that we can all relate to.
Laurie, I love you to have uttered the word quotas, because everyone runs and flees these days from
Did
quota.
I say quotas?
You did say quotas.
Oh my God.
Yes. No, I think it's listen.
Is that a bad? Is that a politically?
I worship you in saying quotas, because I'm sitting here because I'm a product of quotas.
Is that a
And yet,
politically incorrect word? I just need to know.
I am sitting here because I am a product of quotas.
Okay.
Okay.
Maybe I am too.
I am a product of the affirmative action era, from which women benefited the most, but I also had a twofer. I'm also an African American. And now we are at a time where somehow we cannot set specific objectives for better representation and participation by women and by minorities and diversity. And you know, in some of the European countries, I mean, right at this stage of my career, I'm much more involved in the corporate world, that is the for-profit corporate world, and looking at the lack of parity in the boardrooms, because that's where the real seat of power is in terms of commerce. And the only countries that have really made progress in this are the European countries that by law have set quotas to say that the company will be delisted if a proportion of the board does not consist of women.
There's
But
nothing
that's a
wrong with
radical
it, you know?
idea, Faye
Yeah.
Wattleton. It goes
Why
against our ideals as
me tell
Americans who
you.
believe in opportunity for all. And
That's-
quotas goes against that,
That's
Faye.
what affirmative action was. That when I wrote a grant for my Planned Parenthood affiliate to get an OEO grant or a federal Title X grant, I had to show that my staff represented the metropolitan demographic of that particular community. Was that so radical? No. What it did was that it attempted to mathematically rectify or to balance what has been traditionally an unbalanced opportunity for people in our society. And if we can't do it by will, then we have to use other measures and recognize that in times past that those have enabled us to make progress.
But then you do have this problem of unintended consequences. To go back to the election, I mean, I think that one thing that's fueling the rise of Trump is the perception, which, you know, in fact may not have any basis in reality, but that, you know, women and minorities have been elevated, you know, over the, you know, kind of white, what is it, his constituency, the white, uneducated white males. And that, you know, I mean, how do you, you know, you stoke that kind of resentment and then you end up with a Trump?
Well, frankly, I'm not worried about people loving me.
Well, but I think...
in creating social change, you have to recognize that there's going to be some pottery broken.
Well, but I think part of the challenge that the two of you are raising the point that by attempting to rectify past injustice, you stoke the anger of those who are privileged by that injustice. And so how do we reconcile that politically, culturally, socially?
Well, as someone who lived for years with a death threat over her life, you don't reconcile it. You just keep moving forward because you know that to create justice for all really ought to be still the banner that you go for, and recognize that whatever happens, happens. If you're worried about whether you're being criticized, and I think this is what happens, I mean, I did not live in the digital world, and I think our children really do have a much more difficult time, that it's the immediacy of the attacks.
Well, we do too. Whatever.
Still, yeah, but I'm saying they're young and they
right.
don't have the benefit of perhaps the weathered experience
Right.
of it. I think that's something that we can perhaps try to help them to understand, that this is the price you pay. Change does not come about without a price.
Yeah.
But in our democracy, I think what Eleanor is raising is that by pushing social change and accelerating the pace of social change, that the backlash that emerges from that could actually be catastrophic, potentially.
Well,
Yeah.
we're talking about Reconstruction after slavery, though, now. We're living with that legacy. So we are living with legacies of profound enormity for many decades. We live with a legacy of change, but that doesn't mean that we should not continue to work to move the society forward to a more just society.
No, and I totally agree with that. But I think it's very unsettling, I think, to see what's happened, because I do think that, I mean, the way that kind of the notion of political correctness has become, it's like a cudgel in this election, and you can say, where is this coming from? Political correctness. What do they mean by that? And it's sort of the code basically for this notion that they are, the losers. They are being, others are being elevated. They feel unjustly over them. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. We have to move forward, but I also think it's very distressing to see what's going on right now, and it's potentially, as you say, catastrophic.
Yeah, but I think we should also keep this in context. I am the great-granddaughter of a woman who was born in slavery. My and I knew her. I am the great-granddaughter of a woman who was born in 1862. Now think about the arc of history and what has happened and the changes that have taken place. And yes, we do backslide. We've had big backslides on the reproductive rights front. Yes, we do have turmoil, but thinking forward-looking, we have still made progress. And we can't stop and wring our hands over the stress and strain of it. We have to say, but clear-eyed, we still need to get to pay equity. We still need to have decent child care in this country. We still need to have the government out of our bodies. I mean, those are the things that we still have to continue to keep our head down and work for.
Let me ask the three of you this. Anne-Marie Slaughter wrote a seminal piece in The Atlantic, and it was entitled, "Women Still Can't Have It All." And she fomented a firestorm by suggesting, particularly to her generation of feminists who had PhDs, partners in law firms, that you really can't have it all, that the feminists, the movement of the 1960s promised you something that really can't be delivered on. Can women have it all? Career, success, family?
Well, theoretically, yes, and certainly men do. But we were just talking about this, Laurie and I, that there's actually was just a very controversial statement that's gotten, a lot of people have been discussing. The artist Marina Abramovich recently came out with a statement that, how was it she put it?
I have the quote.
Okay.
I have the quote. I thought that was a phenomenal question, though, because I've always thought the notion of having it all for women was one of the most corrosive, destructive ideas possible. Nobody can have it all. I don't even know what that means. And if you try to have a lot, that is to work and to be a parent and to be an activist, chances are you're going to do the best you can and mess everything up anyway. So I thought that was a very, very, very destructive and, as I said, corrosive idea, the idea that a woman can have everything. Like, what is that?
Right. But the quote, yeah.
Okay, sorry. The quote from
I
Marina.
hasn't thought about having it all. Anyway, go with
I'd
the
love to.
quote.
No, let's hear from you.
We're
Faye,
having an
'cause
ADD
Marina,
moment on the panel.
but no, I think Faye, let's hear from you on that, because Marina's quote is quite
Yeah,
provocative,
okay,
and I
but
think
I'd
that
love
would be
to hear
something
it.
else.
You want to provoke me more?
Go ahead.
Because I've never heard in the feminist movement that we could have it all, meaning that we had to embrace it all and do it all. What I heard was we should not be denied because of our gender
Exactly.
from what we want.
Exactly.
And so just as many movements have been distorted and misrepresentation, so has the movements for women's advancement been distorted by people who don't want to see this happen. And so, yes, you try to put us in a box to say, well, you just want to be a career woman, and then you're not a good mother if you're a career woman, or vice versa, that if you're not in a career, then you're a loser because you want to stay home and raise your children. And the question was, is staying home and being in a domestic role the only role for me in a secondary role in society, but rather are all possibilities, and the all was seized upon to say, I've got to have it all, as opposed to the opportunity is all there for me to choose and not to be denied because of my gender.
Well, it was a choice we were given in the movies I saw when I was growing up. You know, the Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn movies, you could have work or you could have love. But if you fell in love, you wouldn't have your work because you'd lose your mojo. And there were so many movies that I watched that gave women a choice to either have love or power.
A choice men didn't have to make.
Never.
But to the quote.
Okay, to the quote. Well, anyway, I want to preface this by saying that in the course of my life as an artist, I had my first child 30 years ago, and I would say the generation of women before me mostly didn't have children. And it seemed that there was a subliminal message in the art world not to have children if you wanted to be an artist. And I hate when anybody tells me what to do, and that might be a reason I had children. But recently, I was interviewed for a couple articles about this Marina quote. And I want to say, for those who don't know what she does, she's considered the grandmother of performance art. She's had shows at MoMA and many museums. But this was the quote from a German magazine. I had 3 abortions because I was certain that it would be a disaster for my work. One only has limited energy in the body, and I would have had to divide it, she said. In my opinion, that's the reason why women aren't as successful as men in the art world. There's plenty of talented women. Why do men take over the important positions? It's simple, love, family, children. A woman doesn't want to sacrifice all of that, which is creating, and there was another line that somehow didn't get included in this that I did read, where she said there are no great women artists. But
Except for her.
But this is a kind of mythology. You know, I've thought so much about this, and I thought, you know, did anybody ever question, let's start a list, it could take forever, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Sheryl Sandberg, Meryl Streep, Margaret Thatcher. I'm trying to, you know, kind of go across the board of women who have children. I don't know if the discussion was the same in your world, or if this is the sort of thing that preserves the kind of mythology. The art world is propped up ultimately on very little. What we do is very ephemeral. It's very hard to explain why art is art, why I'm an artist, particularly in the 21st century. It's a very delicate thing, and perhaps this is the kind of mythology that people feel they need to keep it all running.
Well, I think, you know, and what it sort of brings forward is the notion, so she's sort of suggesting that creativity, you have a limited amount of creativity.
Finite.
Don't waste it on children. You never hear that about male artists. I mean, you never hear it said that a male artist should never have a child because otherwise he'll like lose his creativity. But I think that what it really points to is this, you know, countries where there is a lot more support for the family, women have a lot less difficulty with this ability to have it all. You know, if you have, you know, decent child care, you know, if you know that there's a safety net, you know, then it's much easier to sort of go forward. So this isn't so much I mean, Marina seems to be suggesting that it's a kind of innate, essential aspect of creativity, but it's really structural. And I guess that's the point, is that, and maybe the point that we need to make about sort of feminism in the 21st century is so much of this is structural. And it's not even about sort of, you know, kind of, you know, again, evil men, you know, sort of taking away from women, but it's how you structure your society. And, you know, we've structured a society where you can have an article, women still can't have it all. You know, it's because of the way that, you know, the choices that have been made, but because they've been created doesn't mean that they can't be uncreated.
So let's go to the audience. It's time for questions, so we'll have the lights come up. And I hope that some of you will have questions for our panelists. And we have strolling mics. And there's our first question, the lady down here on the right side, please. Do we have mics? Oh, right, for the lady here. Thank you. And please tell us who you are, and we look forward to your question.
Hi, thanks. I'm Ann McNulty, and thank you for a wonderful, wonderful panel. Actually, my question, you almost got exactly to at the end, but when I think about Sheryl Sandberg, I think she talks about individuals leaning in and the courage of doing that and being strong in your own ambitions. But Anne Marie Slaughter, I think, speaks more to the structural issue. And so it wasn't just that she was saying you can't have it all. She was just saying that in the law firms and the Wall Street banks, the structure is so overwhelmingly against women being successful. And so the bigger issue and the simpler question, I guess, is how do we have all of the caregiving responsibilities more evenly shared? How do you make it so that women are not in charge of the children and their parents and everyone else who needs help? And if it was more evenly shared, both could have it all. So I just wanted to see your reaction to that.
Yeah,
The child care and the cleaning,
Right.
doing the laundry, all of that.
Well, it's about having a society that is deliberately structured that way. I mean, it's so that you have a safety net, so that you have, we need to have more, federally subsidized childcare. We need to have, mandated parental leave. I mean, it's actually not that difficult. But you're right. I mean, a lot of these professions, and law in particular, and Wall Street, et cetera, are sort of structured in such a way that you are supposed to be kind of totally married to that job. And so something's got to give. And the way that things are now, what usually gives is the woman rather than the man. But there's nothing inevitable about these things. And I guess that's the point, and that's the more optimistic point. These aren't innate, these aren't essential, these aren't, these sort of laws of nature. These are things that can be changed, and in some places are.
I think that it really is about the value of women in our society. And let's face it, folks, we have not yet achieved a position that we are excused from being secondary with respect to domestic responsibilities. And I believe that it really is up to women to change that. Until women have a greater presence in the political leadership of this country, and I think that one of the great fears of a woman president is that there will be a perception, we have a woman president and so women now have it, and so we don't have anything else to do here. But until women are really penetrate, and women have to take responsibility for seeing this happen. We now have economic power. We have a foothold in the political process. We have to see to it in whatever our professions are, that women have greater representation. Now that doesn't automatically mean that the power will flow to women, but it does change the dynamic. One of the things that has been found with respect to corporate boards, it's not enough just to have one woman. It doesn't change anything. But when 3 women are in the boardroom, the conversation is very different in terms of what the company does with respect to its female employees.
So we have questions, the lady here in the front, and then the gentleman in the back. And
my name is Cynthia Hill. The only thing I want to say is you're great. Thank you so much for what you said. But women, single mothers, they need help. There needs to be something in place for them to be able to go to work, to be able to have help with the children, because they're doing it on their own.
so Faye Wattleton, you were a successful single mom with that fabulous daughter of yours. What do you say to that?
I do not hold myself up to be a symbol at all in that regard. Is that I was very lucky that I was able to, that I had the privilege of being selected to hold a position, that I had resources, that I was able to come in to help with the raising of my daughter, and then we had doormen that helped make sure that she didn't do things that she wasn't supposed to do. So it does take a village. It takes more than just me. But I think, Cynthia, that's a very good question, because I think it really is emblematic of what we think of women who don't have husbands, who do not represent the construction that we still hold to as the ideal construction. And so, if you want to go and get pregnant and, you don't want to behave morally, and the double standard is still sexually alive for women, very much so, then you take your, that's your punishment. I think we heard yesterday that somebody says, if we give you a little money, then get your act together. And so it really, these are the markers of the lack of social progress and where we need to do work and where we really shouldn't get tied up on, is it feminist or isn't it feminist? What are the everyday issues that women confront? And those are the things that we should focus on. And how do women change that paradigm? We don't need people to tell us how to do it. We can do it. But then we say, well, it's all against us. Well, why are the law firms disproportionately powerfully in the hands of men? That's the question that is before women. A lot of this we have to take responsibility for ourselves. So I think that the treatment of single mothers is really a continuing reflection of it's bad behavior. We really don't support you in conducting your life that way.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Safwan Masri, thank you very much for a really wonderful session. So I'm very glad that you touched on the role of men in feminism. I would have loved to hear more about that. And many things run through my mind when it comes to this. One, do you get the sense that so much of the role modeling that women do, feminists do, is really targeting women, young girls? Do we underemphasize and underestimate the importance of female role modeling for boys and men?
Yes.
So that's one.
That's a great question.
And if I may also, how do we feel about men sometimes taking on leadership positions? Men feminists. So, for example, you mentioned certain parts of the world. I come from a Muslim country where I had to also, create obstructions on a board that I serve on for a non-for-profit. I obstructed every nomination for new board members until what I set as a standard, for better or for worse, that we had to have at least 1/3 of the board members become women before any man can be added. But historically also, you'd be surprised maybe to hear this, but in the Muslim world, in the late 19th century, it was men in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Morocco, and elsewhere who led the charge for the emancipation of women. Some of that has survived in some North African countries. Unfortunately, it hasn't survived elsewhere. So I'll stop here. I'd love to get your reactions. Thank you.
I feel like you've touched on something that's so important and so personally important to me, because I live in such a world of powerful young women and their friends and the young women who work for me. So I'm privy to a lot of information about their dating and mating habits. And what I see is a group of young women who are getting stronger and stronger, more powerful, and have tremendous guidance. So much to read and so much to think about, and mothers who were feminists to talk to. And I see a generation of young men who, I don't want to generalize too much, but who seem to be lost in the face of this change. And my husband and I often have conversations. We feel really lucky that we don't have sons, because we feel like it's so much easier to be conversant right now with women's issues. How do you guide a young man through this new reality? And I think you touched on something so significant, because as women change and as the world changes, young men have to change too. And I'm not sure the structures are in place right now to help them.
So we have the last question here, Amy. Please, Amy Capolato will ask the last question.
Thank you. My name is Amy Capolato. You guys were fabulous, hung on every word. I would just like to say, in my own experience through various iterations of feminism, and I consider feminism vaguely a historical term, but I am old enough to identify with it, so I still use it quite liberally. There's sort of, it always struck me that I sort of believe there's two personalities in the world. I hate to be so binary. There's some ambiguity in the middle, but there's people who are capable and qualified and enthusiastic about fighting for change, and people who are capable, qualified, and enthusiastic about fighting for preservation. And almost always, on the feminist side of things, I'd be like, at some sort of event or discussion or march or something to the effect, like, wow, we're gonna screw this up because we're gonna win and then lose it. Like, I could feel right away there was a room of change agents, but not a room of preservationists to sort of, mark and secure and seal a victory. And so I was wondering if you could speak to the necessity of progress of having inclusive conversations, even with people who feel like they're quite on the other side, but on some tentative, tenuous level might have some alignment with the cause.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that's the point of showing that we have common interests. I mean, and I think that's what we're maybe trying to get towards here, that a lot of these issues aren't just women's rights, but they're really human rights too, and that, that's the point that needs to be made. And for the young men, the question about the young men too, that they're not just being excluded from this thing, that if we're changing the world, we're changing it in a way for everyone. And that's, I think, a tricky thing to do, but I think it's very important. Pardon?
That's sort of like coming from a vantage point where change is optimistic and happy and rainbow and sort of.
But change can be bad too, yeah.
But I don't think it is, and I think that change requires enormous patience, and it requires a full understanding of entropy, which is a medical term for things attempting to pull back. Forward motion, there's always a back motion. And that we somehow think that, oh my God, 20 years ago we were fighting this. We did make progress, we did. And for the people who benefited from that progress, it was progress. But to assume that somehow it's going to stay and that it will be propelled forward, I think is a little bit unrealistic. And they're recognizing that there will be a backlash, that there will be an attempt to take it back to preservation. And the greatest threat, of course, is complacency in that regard, because if you think that there's a revolution and you go home, then that is really a formula for a significant amount of loss in the gains that you
So
make.
as we wrap here, there's a question for the audience.
Oh.
Is 20th century feminism relevant to 21st century millennials? That's the question, and I believe you've been given the instructions so that should you wish to respond to that question. But I do think that one of the things we have resolved here among the three remarkable sheroes on this stage is that it is time to retire the term feminism and replace it with a new construction that is inclusive, that empowers, and that recognizes the role of men and women in social change that advances the cause of justice. So let's see, what's the, wow, 78% say it is still relevant. So thank you all very much. Please join me in thanking Faye Wattleton, Laurie Simmons, and Eleanor Heartney.